Everyone ready?
Yeah.
Off time, I'd like to thank everyone and congratulate my opponents for qualifying to the Tournament of Champions. My order will be simple: framework, plan, background, and 3 advantages. Starting time now. Resolved. The United States federal government should end its lethal usage of drones in Pakistan. Now, first into framework. We define today's resolution because it has a call of action. In the resolution, we define it as a policy motion, so we ask that the criteria be net benefits. Definitions shall be contextual. If my opponents have any questions or concerns about them, they can bring them up in our plan text. Which leads me into our plan. Our plan is, as soon as possible, the United States federal government will end its lethal usage of drones in Pakistan. We would like to note, however, that this doesn't mean that we're getting rid of our surveillance and other non-lethal usages of drones. We're not ending our drone policy entirely, just our drones, specifically our Predator and Reaper drones used for killing people. A little bit of background. According to the World Factbook, we can see that currently, in recent years, Pakistan has become more and more self-sufficient. Now, as of 2014, Pakistan has the 8th largest military unit with around 617,000 active personnel. In addition, in 2013, they started one of the largest lethal drone policies to enable it in order to be able to fight their battles for themselves. And this was largely a political movement to try and get the United States out. Our plan is solving for this by pulling our lethal drone usage out and giving Pakistan essentially what they want. So moving into our advantages. Our first one, title civilian life. Subpoint A is immediate death. Our drone usage causes immediate death and civilian casualties as a result. According to CNN, on November 14th of 2013, we can see that as a result of the United States lethal drone usage in Pakistan, we have lost 67 innocent civilians as a result. And so the impact of this is innocent lives lost, and we weigh this impact very heavily. Because an innocent life is worth a lot more when we're talking about war. The second impact that we like to claim off of this is soft power. We're going to say that for every innocent life that we take at the hands of our drone policy, we lose a significant amount of our soft power because it hurts our image in the international community. The impact of losing soft power, specifically in the Middle East, means that in times of international conflict, we have to resort more to hard power and less on the soft power that we have then lost. And that so the impact of that also would be lives. Subpoint B, terrorism. The usage of drones perpetuates the problems of terrorism and makes the potential loss for life even larger. We can see that according to the New York Times, on June 13th of 2013, our drone they provide the reasoning saying that our drone usage, killing innocent civilians and even terrorists, creates an anti-U.S. sentiment within the region, and that anti-U.S. sentiment is used for the building and the recruitment of terrorist organizations, and so it fuels these terrorist organizations. They band together with the common goal of anti-United States. Additionally, the same evidence tells us that in 2003, we saw that as a result of terrorist activity in Pakistan, there were only 164 deaths in total for that year. But as our drone policy picked up by 2009, the source tells us that there were 3,318 deaths. This shows us that as we pick up our drone policy, as a result of terrorism, terrorism gets worse and worse, not only in the region, but also in other regions as well, as we'll go on to talk about. The impact of terrorism is A, the lives that are lost initially, but B, the potential for more lives to be lost. Our second advantage would be that of legality. We can see that according to the United Nations, their Declaration of Human Rights, we can see that Resolution L.32 tells passed on November of 2014 says that any sovereign nation or any foreign body using drones as a lethal usage in another country is both immoral and also illegal. And so the argument here is very simple. Our policy is going against the standards of the United Nations, and because we, as a member of the United Nations, and have a lot of our allies as a member of the United Nations, there's a very significant impact. The impact of this very clearly is soft power. If we are to end our policy, we gain a significant portion of soft power, and so the impact you can apply the same impact of lives. When we have more soft power, we can resort less to hard power in times of international conflict. Our third and final advantage would be that of stability in other regions other than Pakistan. We can see that when we carry out our drone usage in these regions, it not only fuels recruitment for terrorist organizations within the country, but it also fuels recruitment in other countries and other regions, which makes our fight in the Middle East all that much harder. We can see that 23% of ISIL's current recruitment of their current members, 23% of them were recruited from people in Pakistan, and the reason for that is because of our drone usage. Like we said, this anti-U.S. sentiment makes these people want to join some sort of terrorist organization, and so as we further our drone usage in Pakistan, we further fuel the force that we're fighting on the other front, that is ISIL. And so the impact of this is, first, it means that we extend a lot more resources that we were planning on using, because it makes our fight harder. This is a contradictory policy that we're using. If we're fighting Pakistan and Pakistan is fueling ISIL, we can't also fight ISIL. It makes it that much harder. It makes it that much harder for us to stay in the region. It elongates the amount of resources that we use, and the impact off of that is, first, it isolates the people from the government. The people are no longer willing to support the government. You can imagine a Vietnam sort of style impact from that. But secondly, it also means that because we're using so much money and we're using so much force, we lose a lot more lives in other regions as well. And additionally, our last impact of this would be economic, because our foreign policy is generally geared towards moving in what we call the pivot towards Asia. This policy, this contradictory policy, hinders our ability to pivot towards Asia. And Asia is currently where we're looking at for multiple different economic agreements. The Trans-Pacific Partnership would be one of them, which is estimated to have very large economic benefits for the United States. And so, because we are using our drone policy in Pakistan, it's making us stay in the Middle East longer, and it's hindering our ability and our want to go to Asia and gain those benefits. For those reasons, we affirm.
Yeah. Yes. So, is this your pen? No. All right. Just the order is going to be framework, 2 disadvantages, counterplan, and then on case. Everybody ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Time starting now. Oh, sorry, I said it for 5 minutes. Starting now. All right. So the framework debate, we agree that we want to run this on a net benefit standpoint, but we want to point out the a priori impacts in today's round. Essentially, what we want to look at is lives before anything else. Whoever can save the most lives in the Middle East, and whoever does the better job of actually protecting the people in the Middle East as well as the United States, should be the people who win this round. And the number of lives should be weighed before anything else: economic benefits, soft power, stuff like that. The impact that they've contextualized under their 3 advantages. Going into the first disadvantage, yes?
I have a question about framework. What standard are you using to weigh lives before anything?
Well, the simple fact of the matter is that human life is the most valuable thing that we have. I mean, dehumanization impacts, things like that, are much more important than economic violence. I mean, wars and stuff kill far more people than soft power does. It's just, the lives should be an a priori impact because lives matter more than money. It's just like a simple fact. Anyway. Going into the first disadvantage, that we actually see more casualties if we decrease drone use in the first place. Now, essentially what we have to look at here is that overall, because their plan doesn't preclude other kinds of action, we're going to use these other kinds of action in the United States to deal with the terrorist threat that is still in Pakistan and is still in the rest of the Middle East. The simple fact of the matter here is that almost any other kind of military intervention has more casualties than drone use, not at this time. Essentially what we're seeing here is that according to Scott Shane of the New York Times, more casualties occur with any other kind of intervention. And simply put, the fact of the matter is that entirely eliminating the use of drones will inherently lead to a use of other kinds of military power: ground defensive, airstrikes, using people in jets, using people in like F-22s and things like that, is inherently going to lead to more civilians being killed. The simple fact of the matter here is that other things do kill more civilians than drones do. Yes, drones kill people, but they kill far less people than do ground defensive or do jets. I'll take your points at the end of my speech because I have a lot to get through. All right. Essentially, what we're seeing here is, again, this is an a priori impact. The simple fact of the matter is that lives matter more than hedge or anti-American sentiment or economics, simply because lives are the most important thing. You can't enjoy any of the benefits of economics or hegemony or soft power or anything if you are not alive. The simple fact of the matter here is that if we look at the contextualized definitions that my opponents have brought up, and if we look at the things that their plan is going to cause, we're going to see more people dead. Look at the examples that we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yes, this isn't going to be a full-scale war if we get rid of these drones, but it's inherently going to lead to more ground defensive and more jet strikes, which are far less effective. Essentially, what we can see here is that my opponents, the only lives impact that they've actually brought up that are concrete is that 76 innocent people were killed by drones. But the fact of the matter here is that 174,000 innocent people were killed in Iraq, and tens of thousands were killed in Afghanistan. The simple fact of the matter is that because they're going to be increasing the number of strikes that are inherently less effective, they're going to kill more people in the long run. Essentially, what we're seeing here is that invariably the AF causes other interventions and decrease the number of lives that we're actually going to be saving, both in the United States and in the Middle East as a whole, which is a net detriment to their case because they're killing at least more people than drones are. Going into the second disadvantage, which is that of the technological plateau. Now, essentially, what we see here is that if we stop using our drones in a lethal capacity in Pakistan, which is the most prevalent way in which we use drones, what we have to see is it's going to lead to a technological plateau. And this is important because overall, we see that according to the Government Accountability Office, 76 countries already have at least some kind of drone technology. Even Hezbollah has reconnaissance drones. Essentially, that we're seeing here is because we use a vast majority of our strikes in Pakistan, we would not be able to use them elsewhere and would lead to a technological plateau. We have drone uses elsewhere, but Pakistan is what fuels that technological innovation within the military. Essentially, what we're seeing here is that overall, if we stop the use of drones in Pakistan, if we stop the use of drones, lethal use of drones in Pakistan, we're going to overall see that there's going to be a technological plateau which will harm our military interests in the future, which will lead to more death and more lives lost, and will actually harm both our hard power and our soft power. Yes.
Of our current military policy, specifically with drones, what percentage of our drones are used in Pakistan?
More than 50%. There's a very, very large number of drones that are used in Pakistan. They're used in, at least in the Middle East, there's more than 50% of the strikes that we carry out, more than 50% of the lethal strikes that we carry out are in Pakistan. The simple fact of the matter here is that we cannot allow ourselves to fall behind Russia, China, Hezbollah, etc. Essentially, what we see the impact of this disadvantage is they harm military interests in the long run, which harms the US hard power, harms the United States hegemony, and harms lives in the long run. Going into the counterplan. Essentially, the counterplan is just going to be that the United States federal government isn't going to eliminate its entire drone use in Pakistan, but rather it's going to be able to cut down and use these drones more efficiently through the use of more quality control and oversight from the FISA court. Essentially, what we're going to see here is the FISA court will allow us to make the selection of targets far more selective and far more effective. We don't want to be using drones willy-nilly, but we don't want to get rid of them entirely because we still want to have them as an option in Pakistan if we want them. The simple fact of the matter here is that we're going to have the selection of targets be far better and far more beneficial, and over the long run, we're going to see that they're going to solve for the affirmation's harms and the affirmation advantages far better than the app themselves does. The time frame for this is essentially going to be as soon as possible, and we're going to use a normal means implementation. It's simply going to be done as soon as it possibly can. Okay. So to go into the affirmation's advantages, let's look at the first advantage about civilian life. You can cross-apply the first disadvantage here that other forms of military intervention inherently cause more loss of life than do drones. Again, look at the numbers that I bring up, which are 76 innocent lives lost versus 174,000 lives lost. Yes, we're not going to lose 174,000 lives by getting rid of drones, but it's going to be more than 76. The immediate loss of life will in fact be far greater if we go with the affirmation's advocacy. The simple fact of the matter here is that civilian life is going to be lost more if we use these other kinds of military intervention, which will invariably happen under the affirmation's plan. Don't let them tell you otherwise. It's simply a fact. If we don't use drones, we're going to find some other way to take out the targets. Because their plan doesn't preclude other military action, it's going to happen. It's happening in the status quo and they don't solve for it. The simple fact of the matter here is that we have to look at the fact that they do not solve for civilian life. Going on to their subpoint B about terrorism, I still have a lot to get through. What we have to see is the potential loss of life may be greater with terrorism, but the fact of the matter here is that actually anti-American sentiment goes up more when more people are dying. It's a simple 1-to-1 ratio. Well, not maybe a 1-to-1 ratio, but the simple fact is the more people are killed, the more anti-American sentiment there is. You can look at things like ISIS, which they bring up. ISIS was created by a power vacuum caused by a ground offensive. What we have to see here is that overall, more dangerous terrorists are going to come out of the things that we see coming up with ground offensive and with these other kinds of strikes. The simple fact of the matter is the potential lives lost and more lives lost are going to be worse under the affirmation's advocacy than they are with the counterplan. And the counterplan solves for the harms about these innocent lives because it's going to be using drones in a more effective way. Going into their advantage too about legality, the counterplan essentially solves for this. Additionally, the UN Charter does say that every nation has the right to defend themselves, which is the contextualized definition that the United States used to justify its drone use. And going on to their advantage 3, stability in other regions, again, what we have to see is they're going to create more instability because overall we're going to see ground offensive jets get worse. Look at ISIS like I talked about earlier. Additionally, we have to look at the fact that the counterplan solves better for this because it uses drones in a more efficient way throughout the Middle East rather than simply in Pakistan. So for all these reasons, I urge you to vote in favor of mitigation. Thank you.
Okay. Is everyone ready?
What's the order?
I will first be going into May case, same order they did, 2DA as CP, then I'll be going on case. Okay. So beginning time now. Their first disadvantage is basically relying on the idea that we're going to use another form of intervention if drone strikes were to cease within Pakistan. Yet they completely breeze over and consent to the background that my partner gave right after presenting our plan text, which is that Pakistan has become self-sufficient in dealing with these terrorist attacks. The United States no longer has to intervene. Note that they dropped this background. Note that they dropped the fact that Pakistan has its own drone force, has the 8th largest military in terms of active military personnel. Because they dropped that crucial piece of background, that crucial piece of analysis, we can see that the United States has no need to intervene in Pakistan anymore. Essentially, we can see that the shift has actually been that the United States is withdrawing from the Middle East. The fight with ISIL is literally the only thing keeping us there. We have withdrawn 93% of our active military personnel from Pakistan, and we are actually slowing down our usage of drones as we speak right now. So we can see that there's no reason to believe that my opponent's blanket assertion that we're going to go in with another force that's really, really bad for lives lost. We can see that these drone strikes that Pakistan has are more than effective at keeping terrorism at bay. So there's no reason to believe that this first contention is true at all. So we agree that lives are the most important impact in the round. Yet we solve for lives better than they do because in reality their entire case is based on this idea that other interventions are really bad. And when in reality they never ever prove that we are going to intervene with another force. Their second contention is this idea of a military plateau, how essentially, oh, well, we're going to fall behind technologically speaking. Yet we can see that according to the White House fact sheet published December 2014, over the fiscal years of 2014 and partially 2013, 76% of the drone strikes that we have used have been in the fight against ISIL. We've essentially dedicated all of our drone strikes against the fight against ISIL. So my opponents are again patently false in saying that we're using the majority of our drone strikes in Pakistan. We don't need them there anymore. That's not where the fight is anymore. The fight is against ISIL. So if they're going to assume that we're going to basically become stagnant with our technological usage of drones, that's patently false because of the fight against ISIL. That is where we've dedicated a lot of our forces and a lot of our energy. So we can see that because that fight is not ending, we won't see this plateau. Also, they never really impacted this out to lives. They just kind of say, oh, well, if we stop using drone strikes, then, there's not going to be, we're going to lose more lives in the long run. Just because people have moderate drone strikes doesn't mean that they're catching up to the United States, A, and B, that doesn't directly lead to a loss of lives. They never show that link for you, so this contention by their own logic can be dropped. Their CP is essentially that they're going to use FISA courts to become more efficient with drone users. But first of all, I'd like to point out that FISA courts are basically yes men. In 2013 and since 2011 with the NSA, which is what the FISA courts have primarily been used for, they have approved 34,000 usages of NSA techniques and only denied 12. These FISA courts basically say yes to anything. They are basically just the government saying that their own actions are okay. So just saying that we're going to use these FISA courts as a mediator does not in any way prove that they're going to be more efficient in using drone strikes and that's going to be more lenient. These FISA courts are basically yes men, so there's no real reason that they give you to say that, look, FISA courts mean more efficiency. In fact, if history tells us anything with the NSA, these FISA courts are A, not effective because they just basically say yes to whatever the government wants to do, and B, they are still biting into all three of the arguments that the affirmative team has brought up. Even if they quote-unquote reduce, they don't say by how much, even if they quote-unquote reduce drone strikes, they still bite into all three of the problems with drones that we bring up. And in fact, by reducing drone strikes, you could argue that they also bite into their own second disadvantage by their own logic. Now going into the affirmative team's case, we can see that our first contention of civilian life, they tried to brush off by saying, oh, well, you know, these are a few amount of civilian lives. They dropped the second impact of soft power, Judge. My partner made this clear that, look, when we reduce soft power with the loss of civilian life, that directly leads to a loss of lives, because when you reduce soft power, you have to become more reliant on hard power. You have to become more reliant on using your military to get what you want when you reduce soft power. My partner made this link clear. He made this link to lives, and because they did not respond to that, we can see that that impact is still valid, but additionally, we can see that their only response to this idea that civilians are being killed anyway is, oh yeah, but we're going to intervene with another force. That will be even worse, right? Well, wrong. They never show you that line of reasoning. So we can see that, first of all, the second impact that doesn't even have to do with the 67 civilian lives was dropped, so that is still for the affirmative under this point. But additionally, their response to the contention as a whole is flawed. Subpoint B is this idea of terrorism. Essentially, this is the biggest impact in the round, is that the majority of civilian life does not come from the direct usage of drones. It comes from the loss of life perpetuated by terrorism, the terrorism that we create with these drone strikes. That is the biggest impact in the round. Weigh it over even their own arguments about lives, because terrorism causes the most amount of life lost in this region. We can see that their only response is that, well, more people will be dying equals more hatred, right? But you're continuously using drones. It's the usage of drones that is causing this hatred. They drop the evidence that we give you that essentially after we implemented the usage of drone strikes, the numbers of casualties as a result of terrorism in Pakistan went up by 30 times. Essentially, it's 164 to 3,318. That wasn't as a result of our ground invasion. This happened after we implemented our drone strikes. We can see that drone strikes directly lead to an increase of terrorism, whereas they never show you how other forms of intervention, even if you believe that we're using another form of intervention, which we're not, is a clear violation and creates this active terrorist recruitment. So we solve for terrorism much better than my opponent CP does, because essentially they're not stopping the usage of drone strikes, they're just simply making it less, but they never actually say how much they're lessening the problem. They just say that the FISA court's going to regulate, but essentially that means that we're just going to continue what we're doing anyway. Our second contention is this idea of legality. They say that the CP solves because, you know, we're in defense of ourselves, but in reality, that's exactly what the United Nations says was wrong with this impact. They cited specifically Pakistan and Yemen as examples of US drone strikes being immoral and illegal because of the rampant disagreement of Yemen and Pakistan saying, look, we don't need you here and we don't like you here. Get out. That is essentially why this is immoral and illegal, and by my opponents staying in the region, they admit they're staying in the region, we can see that they are continuously violating this, and again, the impact of soft power, which, as we point out, soft power, and this is the line of argumentation that they never refute, when you lose soft power by undermining the international community, you have to become more reliant on hard power, more lives are lost. They never refute this line of argumentation, and it is a huge impact by their own logic because it goes out to lives. Our third contention is this idea of stability. Essentially, this is the argument that drone strikes in Pakistan, by any measure, help fuel recruitment for other regions, namely ISIL. They say that, oh, well, you know, again, we're solving that by you know, you're going to make it worse by a foreign intervention. Again, that line of reasoning is so bankrupt that it has actually negative money in it. We can see that in reality, this stability is being perpetuated only by the United States' actions within Pakistan. They are keeping that action going. FISA courts will not be effective at making these more effective because they are yes men, because they say yes to everything. They are not going to actually mediate anything. We can see that they are further perpetuating instability in the region, which leads to lives lost. Again, all three of our arguments impact out to lives being lost far more than the negation team can, and their CP doesn't solve. So for all those reasons, I urge a ballot for the affirmative. Thank you.
Okay, so roadmap, I'll be going over CP, off case, on case.
Alright.
Okay. Alright, so starting now. So the affirmation tactic negations CP by saying that the advisor courts is basically like a group of yes men. They won't be able to do anything. They won't be able to discern whether or not drone strikes should happen in certain countries, certain areas in Pakistan. But the thing is, like, the advisor courts are basically like the only option that we have, and it's better to have some option and the possibility of limiting these drone strikes than none at all. And I think besides, like, the fact of the matter is that we don't have to, like, necessarily debate whether or not, like, it's going to necessarily work in debate. Like, the merits of the plan, like the merits of the idea that we do have the option and the ability to selectively create a advisor court council in order to actually be able to, like, selectively select the areas in which we use these drone strikes. I mean, regardless, like, if they don't see an option, like, or the need to have these drone strikes in Pakistan, obviously they won't use it, yes?
You say that you don't have to prove whether or not it's effective. Isn't the point of a counterplan to be more effective than the plan?
Okay, like okay, that's the point. But the thing is, like, regardless of the fact that we have to have we have to talk about like the idea of having the advisory court, like, the idea of having a court or like a council to have the advisory council to actually be able to determine whether or not they're going to go in certain areas. And so it's better to talk about like the merit of the idea rather than like merely the efficiency. But like this is also like the best like way possible. So obviously it's the most efficient way possible. It's the only capability that we have and the best way that we have to do it. And then also talk about how like we don't talk about how much they're going to scale back, like what percentage. But like we don't have to tell you that necessarily. And we can't really tell you that because obviously we have to look to the fact that like the councils want the ones who decide like where we're going to go in Pakistan and where we're going to use these drones. So that's like we have to disregard that. I have a lot to get through, but if I have time at the end, I'll take your point. In response to our first disadvantage, so she talks about how like Pakistan is self-sufficient. That we drop that argument, but the thing is like Pakistan may be self-sufficient, but the thing is they don't solve for the rest of the Middle East. Like they completely drop that in our CP and don't let them bring that up later again because we can see that really that point that we're solving for the rest of the Middle East is the strongest impact in today's round because we're solving for lives like far more than the affirmation does. I have a lot to get through. I'll get to your point soon. And because of that reason, we can see that they don't solve for the Middle East, and therefore we solve more lives. So just because they solve for Pakistan doesn't necessarily mean they're going to solve for like ISIL. They're not going to solve for like the number of civilian lives that we're like losing, or they're even going to solve for soft power. They'll get to later in my speech. And also they talked about like the thing is like if you look towards our counter plan, like once again, like we talked about how it's selective. Like obviously, if we don't see that much of a need to intervene in Pakistan, if they're so self-sufficient, like we won't have these drones going in. But at least we have the option to, in case we need to have back them up, or in case we need to intervene in the case when like things get out of control. So at least we have the option in that case. And so going over the refutation to our second disadvantage, I have a lot to get through. I'll get to your point at the end if I can. In response to our second disadvantage, they talked about how like the White House fact sheet said that 76% of drone strikes are used in ISIL. But the thing is like, okay, it's used in ISIL, but like who goes into ISIL? They talked about like only like 23% of like ISIS militants are stem from like Pakistan, but like what about like the other percentage? Like the majority of ISIS militants, they come from other areas. And obviously we have to scale back on our usage in other areas in order to ensure that we actually solve for ISIS. They don't solve for ISIS whatsoever because they're only scaling back in Pakistan, which only makes up a small portion of ISIS militants compared to how we're solving for the rest of the Middle East, which makes up the rest of these ISIS militants. And so therefore like that response is invalid. You can drop that off the flow. And so like going over the refutations in regards to their first contention. So they talk about like their second contention, they talked about how like we completely draw their argument about soft power and how soft power, any increase of soft power decreases hard power. But the thing is like they're not solving for soft power at all. Just because they're solving for some decrease of civilian deaths in Pakistan doesn't mean you're increasing soft power so radically to the point where you don't have to increase hard power. They're not doing that at all because we can see that the most of the usage that we see with these drones are in other areas of the Middle East. And obviously if we have it in the other areas of the Middle East, that we're still seeing a large number of civilian deaths, and therefore we still see like a decrease in soft power because we still see anti-American sentiment regardless, yes?
If you're going back to your counterplan, if you're saying that you're solving for the Middle East, but you don't tell us how much you're scaling back, how can you claim to solve?
Okay, like obviously if we're scaling back, like even 10%, like even like 40%, 30% scaling back is like sufficient enough to like be like more perceptive or like more specific in order to target this like the terrorists more efficiently. Also, like we talked about, like once again, like scaling back on drone usage won't necessarily save more civilian lives. Obviously, if we scale back if we completely eradicated like what you're proposing in like Pakistan, and if we do that in like other areas, obviously we have to go towards more like intrusive means such as ground troops and whatnot. And we saw like far more civilian deaths with that case than we saw with drones. And obviously, if we see less deaths with drones, and we do scale back somewhat, we're obviously still going to see a net loss in the number of lives. Like decrease in the loss of the number of lives in the Middle East and in Pakistan in general. And so we'll still see that soft power will be far more better solved for with the negation CP rather than the affirmations plan. And so going over their third contention, that they talked about like terrorism. Terrorism is what they solve for, but they don't solve for terrorism. They solve for like a very tiny fraction of terrorism. They talked about how we have the war with ISIS and we have like, the other conflicts in the Middle East, but they don't necessarily solve for terrorism just because they're stemming back the flow of like like the number of drones that we use in Pakistan. Like Pakistan, it's enough to like really efficiently fight terrorism, as a negations CP effectively does, because we're the ones who are more like who cut back far more on like a more general level and a more holistic and like inclusive level by making sure that we're targeting the rest of the Middle East rather than only focusing on Pakistan like the affirmations case does. And we can see that really the fact that they dropped the fact that our CP is focused on like helping the entirety of the Middle East. Like, we can see that like that's like one of the biggest factors and like biggest voters in today's round. And don't let them come up later in their speech and try to like address this, because they completely dropped it and it's completely it's still on the flow and they can't address it later. And because of that reason, because we can see that really the negation is the one who solves for the most number of lives, and because we specifically stated that like lives are a priori in this case, and because they've dropped that argument as well, because they've dropped the fact that like lives are a priori in like the net benefit scale, that we can see that really the negation continues to win, because we're the ones who are solving on a more holistic, inclusive level by including the rest of the Middle East. We're the ones who are actually solving for the increase of terrorism, because we're actually making sure that all areas that could have who could be producing these terrorists are being like scaled back and addressed. We're the ones who really address the second contention of like the increase of soft power. They don't really solve for an increase of soft power whatsoever, because they're only addressing Pakistan. I'll get to your point in a moment. And third contention, they don't really solve for terrorism either, because terrorism isn't going to be solved for just because we simply scale back in Pakistan. Like there are other areas exist and they don't solve for that whatsoever. And because of that reason, like we can see that really on a net benefit scale, the negation is the one who's solving for far more than the affirmation is solving for. And for those reasons, I urge a vote in favor of the negation. Thanks.
The order is just going to be 2 voting issues. Just what the rounds come down to. You ready? Time starting now. All right. So the first voting issue in today's round is basically just lives. Who solves better for the amount of lives that we're saving in the Middle East? Now, essentially, we can see that we solve better for the rest of the lives in the Middle East because inherently it's just the whole Middle East, right? Our counterplan specifically enumerates that we are not going to limit it to Pakistan. It's going to be the United States federal government will scale down its drone use within the Middle East. We're not going to eliminate it entirely. We're just going to make it more efficient. We're going to add oversight. We're going to do all of these different things. The simple fact that we have to look at in today's round, and what should be evident, is the fact that we solve for all these other places where there is only limited to Pakistan. Now, Pakistan is a very large percentage of our drone use, and Pakistan is very important. But the simple fact of the matter here is that we can't actually just look at Pakistan. We have to look at the Middle East as a collective, and we have to look at the Middle East as a whole. Things in Pakistan don't happen in a vacuum. As my opponents themselves told you, 23% of ISIS militants come from Pakistan. And the simple fact of the matter here is that we have to look at the rest of the Middle East. We have to look at places like Yemen. We have to look at places like Iraq. We have to look at Syria. And we have to look at all these other areas where we are currently using drones and where we are currently causing these problems, and create more oversight and create more stability within that drone program. Now, essentially, their response to this is the fact that overall, they say that the FISA court are just yes men. But the simple fact that we have to look at here is that even though the FISA court may not be the absolutely most effective thing in the world, we have to look at the fact that they're better than nothing for the entire Middle East, which is essentially what my opponent's advocacy does. The fact is that they only look at Pakistan, whereas we look at the Middle East holistically. And what we have to look at here is that even though the FISA court may not be 100% effective, they will create more oversight, and they will create more stability within the drone program as a whole. And actually, what we're seeing here is that we solve not only for Pakistan, but we also solve for the rest of the Middle East. And because we solve for the rest of the Middle East, we inherently have a greater probability of saving lives than do the affirmative. Essentially, what we're seeing here is that the FISA court's better than nothing. The counterplan solves for the rest of the Middle East. And overall, we see that, again, they inherently create more people going into these countries. Now, essentially, they say, okay, we dropped the background. But the simple fact is that we don't necessarily care. The United States doesn't necessarily care about a country's ability to, quote-unquote, defend themselves and to deal with problems on their own. We essentially see
Point of order. Saying that the U.S. doesn't care what Pakistan thinks and that we can just go in there regardless of the background of is new response.
Under consideration.
Yep. The simple fact of the matter here is that even if that's new, we have to look at historical precedent. What we have to look at here is the United States inherently cares about its interests and inherently will go in, and we've seen this in the past. What we have to look at here is that we always resort to these hard power, and we always do go in, as we stated in our first and second constructive. The simple fact of the matter here is that even if we do have Pakistan more capable of dealing with its own issues, we see that the United States will inherently go in. Going on to the second voting issue, which is essentially that of regional stability and who can solve better for the stability and these soft power harms in the Middle East. Now, essentially what we have to see here is, again, they don't really help anybody but Pakistan, whereas we help for the rest of the Middle East as well. The simple fact of the matter here is refer back to this hard power argument and the historical precedent that the United States has set, particularly within the Middle East. The United States does act militarily in the Middle East whenever possible and doesn't necessarily trust these other nations to do it for them. The simple fact of the matter here is
Point of order. Again, the argument that we don't care about soft power, we use hard power anyway, is again a new argument that was not brought up in a constructive speech.
The fact of the matter is, it's just historical precedent. We brought up the fact that we do go into these countries, we have gone in the past, and I don't really see how it's a new argument. Okay, basically let's go into the next part, because if they're going to keep saying it, then I won't even try. What we're usually going to say here is that soft power advantage isn't really fleshed out because it doesn't work. Now going into the counterplan. Now basically the refutation against the counterplan again is the fact that the FISA court is essentially yes men. And that we don't really tell you how much we would be scaling back, what percentage, how few drone strikes we would be using, but the simple fact of the matter here is that it would actually be incredibly irresponsible for us to do that, as my partner talked about earlier. We don't really know exactly how much we want to scale back because overall we don't know how much we're going to need drones. The simple fact of the matter that we have to look at in today's round is we wouldn't want a situation where we want to use drones and yet we have already filled our drone quota, which is essentially the reason as to why we don't want to create a certain percentage scaled back of drones. If we've already used our requisite number of drone strikes, then we won't be able to take out a high profile target if we want to. But what we have to look at here is by creating oversight and creating selectivity, it's preferred over creating a drone quota, it's preferred over creating a defined scaled back percentage of drones, because overall the Middle East is dynamic and it's not static. We can't simply look at this scaling back of drones as something that we can do in a vacuum. We have to look at it contextualized, and we have to look at it in going into the future, which is why using the FISA court, because one, it is basically our only option, and two, it does allow for a more selective and more oversight in the long run. It actually solves better for these impacts than anything that simply getting rid of drones in one country but not doing anything for the rest of them, or simply doing nothing would do. We have to see here that the counterplan is inherently the most effective way in which we can do this, even if it's not perfect. The simple fact of the matter is that no solution is going to be 100% effective, but using the counterplan and going with the FISA court and doing all of the Middle East rather than simply doing Pakistan is in fact the better way to handle this problem, and it's not a good way to do it, as my opponents would have you believe in their affirmative advocacy. Essentially, what we're seeing here is they don't solve for regional stability because they don't actually deal with terrorism. They inherently send more people into these countries because we're going to use our hard power. They inherently use other places, and they don't provide any oversight or selectivity for the rest of the Middle East. Essentially, what we're looking here is a dynamic proposal using the court system and using selectivity and oversight versus a simple blanket statement of getting rid of all lethal drone strikes in Pakistan. You have a dynamic proposal versus a static proposal. So for all those reasons, I urge you to vote in favor of the mitigation. Thank you.
Time, I have two voters for you. Starting time now. The first voter is this idea of a misunderstanding. My opponents base the majority of their offense, they use this in their first disadvantage, and then they use this to respond to the majority of the AF's offense, on this idea that if we stop our drone usage, then we're going to use alternative methods. We believe that the affirmation has clearly won this argument in today's debate, simply because my opponents dropped the background block. They try and make a response in the rebuttal, but we point out that was a new argument, so we have to disregard that. Essentially what happened in today's debate is my opponents dropped the entire background block where we talk about how Pakistan is self-sufficient, and we say that wouldn't be in the United States' interest. You have to disregard everything that my opponent said in the rebuttal because all of that stuff was new. And so we can see that, and the implementation this has on the debate is, first off, it takes off half of their offense as far as their disadvantages go, but it also gives us access to our first advantage, subpoint A and subpoint B, and it also gives us access to our third advantage about stability. And so it grants a lot of offense on the side of the AF, and it's a large reason to vote. That leads me into my second voter of impact calculus. We have to look at the impacts in today's debate. You can cross-apply the logic that I give you about because they dropped the background argument that we're not going to use alternate methods, then a lot of our offense is still on the flow, and so you can weigh that heavily. But then when we go in and look through their we look through their advantages and we look through their entire case. Their first one would about alternative forces. We've already defeated that with the background thing, but we can also see that because they dropped the background argument, we can see that that means that their impact is very small because of a very small likelihood, or very small probability. Impact is made of probability and magnitude. The probability of alternate forces going in, regardless of the magnitude being large, the probability is very, very low, and my opponents have lost that argument. Additionally, their second one about the technological plateau, we said that first and foremost, that how significant is this? They never quantified that, and so their impact is small on that, and because they don't quantify it, we don't really know what to do with that impact. Now, probably the biggest thing that they have on the flow is their CP, and a lot of the impact is weakened on their CP specifically because of their lack of solvency. We bring this up time and time again, and they've quoted us saying this a few times, is that the FISA court is just a bunch of yes men, and we give you examples of their work with the NSA, and my partner gives you specific evidence of all of the things that they've agreed to, and only 12 of them they've disagreed to. We can see that because the FISA court is are yes men, we're not going to be scaling this back that much. And additionally, as far as impact calculus goes, we like to make the argument here. That our impacts are extremely certain. We give you all of our impacts are direct and certain, and we know that those things will happen. Like we know that we'll stop losing lives in Pakistan because of we're stopping our lethal drone usage. But what we don't know is the impacts that they have as far as scaling back our drone usage in the entire Middle East, if we can scale them back at all. And because my opponents can't quantify how much we're scaling them back, because again, we don't know what the FISA court will do, we can't quantify their impacts. So their impacts on their entire case are extremely weak. We weigh that in favor of the affirmation. Looking at our first advantage, this is probably the biggest one. Like I said, both of these flow through. Both of these can be extended because my opponents have lost their first disadvantage, and that is the only logic that they use. Even absent that, we can see that my opponents made the mistake of dropping our impact of soft power, which are on our subpoint A of immediate death, and arguably our impact of soft power is a lot larger than our impacts of just the immediate the immediate lives that are lost. And so we can impact that out to lives. And we agree that today's debate should be weighed on lives, and it's very clear that we're winning on lives. There, our subpoint B about terrorism, this is probably our biggest argument, and we've won this as well because of my opponent's first disadvantage is lost. And what we can see here, and the reason why we should weigh this in favor and above my opponent's advantages, is because when we reduce terrorism, that's a larger impact. You can cross-apply what my partner said. We have a larger impact of reducing terrorism because terrorism is the largest source of lives being lost. And so if we cut off, or at least reduce the total amount of terrorism, we can see, again, not only do we stop the amount of lives that are lost immediately, but we also stop the potential for more lives to be lost in the future. My opponents do a poor job of refuting our second advantage about legality. They say, yeah, well, we don't really care about legality. We do care about legality because the impact is soft power, and again, the idea flows through that soft power is a direct link into lives lost, because the less soft power we have, the more we have to resort to hard power, and more lives get lost there. In our third about stability, this is where we address the entire Middle East, not just Pakistan, so the magnitude of our impacts are large there, and we can see that we've won this, and my opponents also, if you don't buy that, my opponents also dropped our econ impact, so we have that on flow as well. For those reasons, judges, I urge you to vote for the F. Thank you. Would you like us to
Thank you for judging. Appreciate it.
No, that's fine. Let's talk on those two.
Do you want to or no?
No.
Thank you.
So my view on like plain text is that if like specification becomes a big deal in the round, then I look at it.
Okay.
But in this case, everyone knew what it was.
Yeah.
I forgot to list the topic in my RFD,
Okay.
even though I told the judges to do that.
Should I put arm?
So you should put that.
I did. Yeah.
Awesome.
Pleasure.
Just put like drones.
Yeah, that's what I did. For sure. Okay.
Did it?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me update. So this was a 2-0 decision for the affirmative from Windsor. I'll start first because I need to go and talk to town. So I basically see 2 points of offense. One point of offense talks about why alternative to drones are bad. I think they're correct that they're delinking you at the point where you're dropping evidence on
Yeah.
top of the case. That's out. Second point is of offense is the counter plan. I think you're not winning that because you're not addressing the solvency takeouts on like 12 out of 34,000 applications to FISA being rejected. That's a pretty damning statistic. Also, I think the other answer is like FISA is not in any way qualified to deal with drones in
Yeah,
Pakistan.
I realize that rebuttal. It's like, wait,
Yeah,
we don't have
like
this authority.
Like it's not so much the authority, like your counter plan gives them the authority, it's just like that the people who work there are not qualified to do that, like they don't have military training.
Well, what do you think would have been a better actor? Because I mean, I just thought of the first court that came to mind.
Create an actor,
Create an actor.
or if in doubt, create an actor.
Okay.
But like
Wasn't aware of
explain
that.
who appoints people to that committee and so on, right? I mean, the governments create actors all the time, it's just, does Congress like nominate, how does that work, right? Things like that.
Okay.
Which would still be vulnerable to takeouts,
Yeah.
right? But it's better than FISA.
I
So,
think it's better than
but
this.
I think like honestly the only possible way that the negative then had a chance to win this round is they said, well, this counter plan applies to everything. Your plan only applies to Pakistan, right? I think you're losing that argument because Jackson makes the weighing in his last speech, which says like the impacts outside of Pakistan may happen, but they're not really quantified. His impacts are very clearly quantified, so I'm voting for that. That's a pretty good weighing. I don't think you guys should have had to deal with that argument though, because you need to figure out how to like do partial perms, right? So if you look at a counter plan that does things in Pakistan and outside of Pakistan, and you're afraid that you might lose the outside of Pakistan weighing, then you need to read a perm which says we will like have that agency, regulate things in other countries, but not in Pakistan.
Oh, that would,
Yeah.
So just be like, do our plan in Pakistan, do their plan everywhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
That's
then you don't even have to deal
no,
with
it's
it.
do your plan everywhere else except for Pakistan.
Right.
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
committee would regulate. We would have actually it's not even a partial perm. It's just a full perm. We would have the regulatory committee, and we would end drones in
But-
Pakistan.
Yeah.
But the committee still solves everywhere
So
else.
first order of business, no drones in Pakistan, but rest of it regulated.
Right. Yeah.
Then we have to get rid of the solvency press.
Okay, I actually have to run, and I need my computer, so your RFD doesn't really matter for history. Sorry, Taha.
It's fine. I don't care.